Well, good morning again, everybody. At least it's morning here in Denver. If we have anybody in the East Coast or Central Time Zones, good afternoon. Welcome to the fourth, I believe, of our series called Soul Series of webinars. Today we're going to be focusing on fractured souls facing moral distress. We're going to be highlighting some key work in the areas of working with folks who are struggling with issues like trauma, post-traumatic stress, all the anxieties and difficulties that come as a result of those horrific experiences, whether that's from trauma in terms of abuse or whether that's wartime trauma of either being on the battlefield or being in a state of readiness for battle. Whatever the case might be, trauma is a terrible and horrible experience that way too many people have had. And so the goal today is very simple. The goal today is to grow in our understanding, grow in our empathy, grow in our compassion, and grow in our skillful response in whatever characteristics and whatever context we might be in. One of my goals is to really support, to encourage, to bring hope and encouragement to the school teachers out there, bring hope and encouragement to nurses, hospice workers, rescue mission folks, people involved in serving in their local soup kitchens or food bank ministries at their local church, people who just have a kind heart for neighbors who are going through a difficult time. My goal in each of these seminars, in each of the writings that I put out there, is to nurture that hope, nurture that encouragement. So if you find today hopeful or encouraging, please share it, whether that's just word of mouth, whether that's through your social media, whether that's through classes that you're involved in or service projects that you're doing. I really want to get the word out there that this is a resource for people who consider themselves agents of hope, bringing faith, hope, and love to the lost and the lonely and the brokenhearted people out there that just need a little extra love in this world. So again, welcome. So glad you could be with us. This is Fractured Souls Facing Moral Distress. I'd like to begin by highlighting our goals for today. The first goal, as I mentioned, is to view trauma and view folks that have gone through war or the threat of war through the lens of the soul, which I'm using that term intentionally to refer to the whole person, all of us, all of our inner life, that it's viewing this through the lens of the soul and the loss of personal identity. Second goal, to grow in our empathy and understanding for the invisible wounds that survivors carry with them. Our third goal, really want to identify the key partners in the restoration, specifically of the warrior's soul. There are many, many people out there focused on healing and restoration and support for folks who have gone through, for instance, domestic violence, folks who have experienced the horrors of human trafficking. So we're not going to touch on every partner out there, but specifically there are two partners I want to highlight who are doing amazing work in the restoration of the warrior soul. And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit about warrior medicine to the work of restoration as souls return home. And this, some of this you will see can apply to folks who have faced maybe traumatic experience as a child, just from an unstable home life. Maybe they've experienced trauma through the battles of wartime or just the constant battle readiness that folks who have lived through military life are fully aware of. So those are our goals today, and I look forward to journeying with you through this time together today. By the numbers, specifically just folks who have served in these wartime experiences, the lost, the injured, the missing in action as the Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, going on 74 years this past June 6th, 226,000 casualties. That includes the wounded, the injured, again, the missing in action. If you go over to Normandy, France today, you know that there are thousands upon thousands of Allied graves along the hillsides of Normandy. It's uncertain exactly how many forces of the opposition were killed in action, or the casualties, but we know that the numbers are just astonishing. Approximately 50 years ago this summer in the jungles of Vietnam, there were approximately 500 deaths per week. And then in recent times, the last 16 years with the forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, approximately 3 million veterans have been deployed to those regions. I didn't specifically look up the casualties for that, but it's astonishing just to think about the numbers. Approximately 3 million in the last 16 years have spent time in Iraq and Afghanistan. And if you think about it, millions upon millions of our veterans served during the Cold War days in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, knowing that any minute there was the threat of nuclear annihilation, and sometimes the guilt, sometimes the fatigue, the post-traumatic symptoms that come from that level of service just in the military are just as astonishing. As I mentioned earlier, trauma can come in the shape of any shape or size. It could be trauma through a one-time incident like a car accident. It could be the unstable childhood home, families struggling with homelessness. It could be violence in the family. It could be violence from an intimate partner. I had the honor and privilege of spending a year working in a counseling center that spent a lot of time treating the offenders of domestic violence, those offenders who had lost control and raged in their anger and were in the court systems as a result of that. Approximately 20,000 calls per month happen in the domestic violence hotlines across America. The statistics show that approximately 10 million people per year are abused by an intimate partner. The same statistics are also that 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men have been victims of some sort of physical violence by an intimate partner in their lifetime. Let me tell you about art. This is a quote from Art, and I'm going to be referring to a lot of the work of one particular author, Dr. Edward Tick. He wrote the book War in the Soul, which I'll be referencing quite a bit. He also wrote the book Warrior's Return. I'm going to try to hold up this book here. Warrior's Return is also a great reference book by Dr. Tick. Art was a young man 50 years ago, drafted into the jungles of Vietnam. His job as an infantryman was to man a rather large machine gun that was an outpost from this strategic base that would daily come under attack by the North Vietnamese Army, the Viet Cong guerrilla warriors. And so their art would be maybe 20, 21. I can just picture Art skinny, looking afraid, maybe a little scruff in his beard. And there he was, manning that machine gun day after day, just knowing that wave after wave after wave of enemy combatants were going to come rushing over that hill. And when he came to see Dr. Tick, he came as a person who was on 50% psychiatric disability through the VA administration. He had lived for 30 plus years with the horrors of the trauma that he experienced in the jungles. And as Dr. Tick sat down with him, Art began to recount one particular day where he was on his machine gun post, and he talked about the wave after wave after wave of people coming after him. And he talked about how he just kept firing and firing and shooting, and at one point he called to his left and called to his right, calling for someone to bring him more support. And he looked around and no one was there. And so he said there was just something instinctually that happened inside of him, and he just leapt out of that foxhole and began to run. He said he could hear the breath of the enemy right over his shoulder. He said he'd never felt so scared in his life, and he told Dr. Tick that's when it happened. In an instant, like a snap, he said, "My soul left." Dr. Tick asked him, "What do you mean by that?" He said, my soul fled. He said, all of a sudden I could see my soul, my innermost being, running right alongside of me. And it was running faster than I could run, and it was running and running and running so fast that I was trying my best to catch up to it. Art began to run for safety, and he ran past the next line of defense and the last line of defense, and he kept running to find the remaining fellow soldiers in his unit. And he ran all the way to the mess tent, all the way to the lunchroom, where he had this blue chair that he sat in every day. He said, if I could just find that blue chair, I would be okay. Well, he stopped dead in his tracks. The mess tent had been obliterated, literally up in smoke. If he had stayed one more hour at breakfast and had not left for his early morning patrol, he would have been up in smoke, literally. So when 35 years later, it's sitting in Dr. Tick, who's an expert psychotherapist. He's done work with veterans. He's been doing work for years with the folks dealing with the aftershocks of Vietnam, and then again, other veteran groups from Korea, World War II, Vietnam, modern-day wounded warriors coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan. Art said to Dr. Tick, I shouldn't be here. I should be dead 1,000 times. My soul has fled. I felt it leave. Dr. Tick explains in his view what he sees as the soul. He says the soul is at the center of human consciousness and experience. We see it feelingly in terms of how Shakespeare uses those words about the soul from his play, King Lear. So the soul is really hard to nail down. It's really hard to understand. It's kind of like trying to pin Jell-O to the wall. But the soul is really the seat of all that is to be human. It's the whole sum of our intellect, our emotional thoughts, our emotional feelings, our will, our volition. It's where we experience all of life's deepest experiences. So war, trauma, and the soul. So what happens to our innermost being when we experience trauma, when we experience violence, whether we witness the violence and it didn't necessarily happen to us, or we experience the battle firsthand? War in particular, and all trauma, threatens the soul's greatest purpose, which is to integrate us. If you could imagine a puzzle, or like the image on your screen, which is a little paper man with a tear coming down his eyes, trying to put together the broken heart. That's what our soul is meant to do. It's meant to bring us whole, W-H-O-L-E, when we feel like we have a hole in our heart, an H-O-L-E in our heart. Our soul is there to integrate us. It's there to integrate our mind, our body, our spirit. It's there to reshape our thinking, our reasoning, our reality. And so when trauma after trauma after trauma or abuse continues to assault our soul, eventually we disassociate. Eventually the soul literally flees. And so in psychological terms, you may be familiar with the old term of multiple personality disorder, which has been renamed and more appropriately dissociative disorder, where under the pain oftentimes of violence or trauma or battle scars, our self flees or our self splits. The soul, the true self, truly does leave. It breaks. It has a disassociation from the whole. So war, trauma, and the soul. Let's look at the impact. First of all, we realize that war is hell. That is the least we could say about it. We know that in wartime, the units, the soldiers, the battalions of men and women, whether they're on an aircraft carrier, whether they're behind the scenes jumping in as paratroopers, whether they're supporting the operations as mechanics and flight operators and nurses and doctors, we know that in order for the military to succeed, the collective has to replace the individual. And From the moment that they step in on boot camp, everyone looks alike, dresses alike, talks alike, has to be a collective. There's no longer an individual. Because of that, oftentimes in war, people, men and women, feel like their own moral codes have to be betrayed. One person in War and the Soul talked about being sent to the jungles of El Salvador in the early 80s when the United States government were sending military forces to support the overthrow of the El Salvadoran regime. And this man said, I was staring at a peasant farmer, scared, trying to defend his farm, and in my ear I have a sergeant yelling at me, kill him, kill him, kill him, or else I'll have you court-martialed. And so the man says, I pulled the trigger, and then I vomited. I couldn't believe that I went against my own moral code in that moment. Oftentimes we're raised with a moral code, thou shalt not kill. And yet in war we send men and women to battle who have to wrestle with that. Sometimes the trauma and the impact of war isn't just the physical violence, it's the state of combat readiness. I heard an recent Afghan veteran speak a few years ago about how coming back to the States, he felt like he always had to be in combat alert, combat readiness, always ready at a moment's notice. And so oftentimes we see portrayed in movies and television shows these war veterans who struggle with flashbacks and struggle with how to handle loud noises, or they see a hallucination of the enemy chasing after them. Well, part of that is the combat readiness. And so for him, it was like his inner clock was separate from the true clock that we base our life off of. And so the closer and closer he could get his inner clock aligned with the true 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 24 hours in a day, 365 days in a year, as soon as he could get off of combat readiness and get to a true time readiness, he felt like his anxiety, he felt like his ability to cope with the world around him was just a mess. Ultimately, Tick points out that in generations and generations gone by, war was not as much about the violence, and it wasn't as much about the killing, as it was about this playing out of what was going on in the mythological world, whether that's Greek mythology with Zeus and Hercules and Achilles and the gang, or whether it's Native American mythology of what people like Sitting Bull were raised with. That at the point you hear of World War II veterans talking about, well, the great meaning of World War II was to get rid of the tyranny of the Nazi regime. Going back to even World War I, that was billed as the war to end all wars. Fighting of the Civil War, there was a great meaning to it, to end all slavery. Once it got to be Vietnam, and even in our modern day war, there is a sense that veterans really do not connect to a greater meaning for what is going on. And so that can bring a great deal of trauma. Next, we're going to take a look at what happens when a person experiences trauma, the impact of trauma. Again, whether you listen to someone who's been abused as a child, or whether that's someone who was killing on the battlefield, you'll hear them talk about feeling dehumanized, truly feeling broken. They talk about a loss of identity. Again, that goes back to wartime when they have to replace the individual with the collective. And they also feel like they've lost their freedom. They felt like they've lost a sense of personal meaning, feel trapped, feel tortured by the flashbacks, by the night terrors that they experience, and they feel victimized. Oftentimes there's secrets involved, especially in the domestic front of trauma and abuse. Oftentimes there's family secrets that run really, really deep, and no one feels safe to talk about, or no one wants to bring those secrets to the surface. They're afraid of what that might do and what trauma might ensue if they talk about these things. Finally, the impact to the soul. We talked about how the soul for Art literally split. It literally separated from him. I know of another person who talked about, very bravely the experience of growing up in abuse and realizing long into adulthood that they had lived for years with a dissociative personality disorder and didn't even really realize it. And so our soul, our innermost being, needs to create life. We have a desire and a drive to create life. So war and trauma, violence, takes that away. The soul has this level of awareness, has this level of intellect, mind, body, spirit. Trauma and war impacts that severely. Our soul can be looked at as conscience. Our sense of right versus wrong comes from our soul, comes from this inner being. Well, as we talked about, facing fractured souls means we have to look at what happens when someone's experiencing moral distress. Their sense of right versus wrong is under complete attack. The soul is there also for our will, our choices. I have the ability to choose which flavor of ice cream I want. I have the ability to choose who I want to get married to. I have the ability to choose how I want to raise my family. I have the ability to choose who I'm going to be friends with, who I'm going to spend time with. And when a person has been impacted by war, violence, trauma, abuse, it really feels like the ability to make even sometimes simple choices is completely taken away from them. The soul is also the seat of intimacy and imagination. I love how Tick brings that out. Everything that is intimate about being human and everything that is imaginative. Think about people like Walt Disney and imaginative people who are like Elon Musk, who are launching rockets into space and imagining what it would be like to set up a colony on Mars. That comes from a person's deepest being. That's a person's soul. And if a person has experienced trauma and abuse to that part of them, then that's going to severely hinder their ability to have imagination. Many of us are familiar with the acronym PTSD and post-traumatic stress disorder. First really kind of came onto the scenes post-Vietnam. Soldiers coming back from World War I, World War II, oftentimes were spoken of having soldier's heart. Even going back to Civil War days and days prior to that, soldiers on the battlefield who were stressed out, who were exhibiting symptoms of what we would call PTSD today, were oftentimes told that they were suffering from nostalgia. I never thought of it that way. I think of nostalgia as thinking back to the good old days. Well, maybe that referred to their thinking back to the flashing back to the battlefields and what they experienced. Tick describes PTSD in this way. He says it's a stress disorder that is a constellation of fixated experience, delayed growth, devastated character, interrupted initiation, and unsupported recovery. And it really gets back to this, what comes first, the moral injury of feeling like you're somehow injured at a deeply personal level, and then that breeds the PTSD, or because of this stress disorder that is lingering, I find myself struggling with moral injury. I don't know. I tend to agree with Tick. I think that the violence, the war, the abuse injures us at a moral and personal level, and because of that, it exhibits itself in these characteristics of something like PTSD. So moral injury asks these questions. When we face the injury, the assault upon our soul, it causes us to ask ourselves, am I a good person? Is there something wrong with me? Did I do something wrong? When that soldier shot the innocent person in the jungle of El Salvador, that was that distress. That was the violence that he committed then turned to injury deep inside of himself, which then led to an inability to cope, an inability for his soul to integrate mind, body, and spirit. Another question that moral injury asks is, am I lovable? Am I acceptable? Think about the little child who was abused. You hear in stories of people who were survivors of that level of abuse talk about how they really struggled to find love and acceptance. Another question that moral injury asks is, will I ever feel like myself? Can I be forgiven? Deeply, deeply personal questions, hard questions to look at. Let's take a look at how do we face moral injury. For each person, it's different. I read a story of a father during the Holocaust who, in his little village in Poland, they literally had like a cattle pen in the middle of the town where the rounded up Jews would be put in if they were, and one section of it was the people who were going to be loaded up and taken to the gas chambers, and the other section were those who were waiting, and then there were still some that were allowed to be free. Well, one day a father who had been separated from his 10-year-old son walked by and saw his son in the pen that was eventually going to be taken to the gas chamber. And the father was completely distressed, didn't know what to do. He ran to his rabbi and said, "Rabbi, what should I do? And, is there any way that I could, steal someone else's son and swap him for my son?" And the rabbi said, "No, that would be wrong. You can't inflict that type of injury upon another person." And so this person, this Holocaust father, had to face what it was like to know that he could not do anything to save his son at that point in time. And then there was the story of a Canadian commander who was on a peacekeeping mission in Rwanda at the point when the genocides were taking place between the Hutu tribe and the Tutsi tribe approximately 24 years ago in the mid-90s. And this was a lifelong devoted military commander, had risen in rank, had felt like it was his life mission to serve in these peacekeeping roles. And once the outbreaks of mass genocide and violence took place, he felt like he had lost all hope, lost all control. He went back to Canada. He began to exhibit poor judgment. There was even newscasts in the early 2000s of where he was found publicly drunk and sleeping on a park bench, and how far this great commander had fallen just because he was unable to really face the moral injury that had happened to him. We could go on and on and on. There's another story of a Rwandan husband who was told, "Kill your wife," who was a part of the opposite tribe than he was, "or we'll kill you." And then I think about recently in our day and age, all the people coming out through the USA Gymnastics scandal, those involved in the Me Too movement, just hundreds and hundreds and thousands of folks who had been suffering in silence, trying to cope with their moral injury and what it took to face that moral injury, to tell the truth, to stand tall, and to confront the atrocities that they went through. Most can't even imagine the level of strength and ability that it took for them to do that. So we've taken a look now at what damages come from violence, from trauma, from war, the damages to the soul. We looked at the flashbacks. We looked at the inability to make simple decisions. We looked at the constant state of battle readiness for those who experience violence in the home, the constant fear, the constant tension of walking on eggshells, that anything that they could do or might do might lead them to experience more violence, more abuse, more trauma. So how can we walk with these folks to the road home? Again, you and I are not the experts. As much as I have a heart for veterans, as much as I have a heart for the brokenhearted who experience these traumatic events, I know that at a certain point, my expertise is going to run out, and that they're going to potentially need greater expertise, greater help, greater support than what I can provide them. And so I have to be very aware of my self-limitation. I have to be very aware of that boundary. So as we look at the road home, each of us will have a different point in how we're able to help. Maybe our ability to help will be to just compassionately listen to a person tell their story of what it was like to be on the battlefield of Vietnam, or maybe the battlefield of Korea or World War II. Maybe our skill level will be to know how to, just at the right moment, provide a compassionate hug and an extra dose of genuine care for someone in our neighborhood who is coming back from a war, or maybe in the course of developing a friendship with a colleague or a coworker, we find out that they confide in us, that they went through a traumatic childhood, and the best gift that we might be able to give to them is our empathy, our understanding, our compassion, and an encouragement to seek out help if it's warranted, if it is needed. Not everyone is going to need the professional level of help, but I think just about everyone who's gone through this level of trauma and violence at some level is going to need a compassionate companion to walk with them on the road home. So let's take a look at the road home. The road home, according to Dr. Tick, involves catharsis and witness. Catharsis being literally that purging of emotion, getting these emotions out, no longer stuffing the feelings that have come along. Witness is that idea that it takes a compassionate presence. It takes someone standing side by side of the person who has been traumatized and witnessing them unload their soul, unload these burdens. Not there to give advice, not there to judge, not there to fix things, but simply there to witness in the suffering, witness in the pain that has gone on. Tick is a big advocate of telling the truth. People whose souls have been damaged in whatever form or whatever fashion, they need to be able to tell the truth. And so many of them live in fear that no one will be able to hear their story, or people will simply judge them and simply dismiss their experience. So that's why starting as being a compassionate presence and a good listener will help the person tell the truth, help them talk openly about their struggles and share their story. And ultimately, one of the biggest goals on the road home is to find meaning, even in the worst circumstances. And that's probably the hardest thing for some of these veterans who are coming back and feeling like, well, there was no meaning of what I had to do. I don't have a larger story that I can connect to. I don't have some great mythological, spiritual drama that I'm living out as the Native American culture viewed it, as the Greek mythology viewed it. They simply feel like they were just a hired gun to kill this innocent person in a jungle far, far away. But by listening and witnessing to their story and encouraging these folks to find meaning in these dire, horrible circumstances, there's a great deal of healing and restoration that can come along. And eventually, that leads to our next point, the fourth point on the road home, is that we want to see people shape a new growth identity. Instead of seeing it as a post-traumatic stress disorder, we want people to see and reframe this stress and this trauma as a growth opportunity. We want to see post-traumatic stress growth. Try to say that 5 times fast. And sometimes people even are starting to drop the D off of the acronym. Instead of always calling this a disorder, it's a wound. It's not always a disorder. Disorder means that there's something wrong with the person that's gone through this. Oftentimes there's nothing wrong with the person other than they haven't grown through their experience yet. They haven't restored their soul yet. They haven't found the integration yet of finding meaning in the midst of these awful circumstances. A great resource to go back to might be for you to reread if you read it a long time ago, or pick up for the first time Man's Search for Meaning by Dr. Viktor Frankl. Again, a Holocaust survivor who, even in the midst of the worst circumstances, was able to find meaning and help many, many other folks find meaning in the midst of the worst circumstances, so that, again, they could shape a new growth identity. So how do we find meaning? How do we make this growth happen? Well, Tick says, first of all, it takes cleansing. It takes purification. And he uses those words intentionally, cleansing and purification, to literally have almost like a baptism, or take a bath to wash off the old to make room for the new. And the next step Tick gives us is the power of storytelling. And again, it doesn't take a PhD to be a good listener. It doesn't take a PhD or an MD to help someone tell their story. It takes skill and it takes compassion, but it doesn't take an advanced degree to encourage someone to tell their story. And the power of storytelling is that it becomes a map for this person's soul. The power of storytelling is that it allows the inner poet, the inner artist to come out. Sometimes even if the person who tells the story isn't able to draw or write, if you're able to witness their story, if you're able to receive their story well, maybe you're able to even just draw a stick figure for that person. Or maybe you're able to paint a picture for them in your words and your language. You know what, John? As you tell me about that story of what it was like to be on that battleship and fear that you were going to never see your parents again and never see your siblings again and never get home to that girl you wanted to marry, you know, I see an image of a mountain of a man. I see an image that is of a mountain that is peeking up out of the Pacific Ocean. And it's you, John. I see that in you. You know, it's so powerful as you listen to stories to point out these images that come out in the story. And again, we must remind ourselves, all of us are born with a really good fix-it gene. I don't know where it is on the gene strand or what part of the chromosomal structure it happens. I think maybe as a guy we're a little more prone to being Mr. Fix-Its. Well, we have to just stop it. We cannot, in these difficult times, in these sensitive times, be a Mr. or a Miss Fix-It. We have to receive the story. We have to button our lips and literally listen in silent witness of the story. And let the pain of the story tell its story. Don't try to put words into people's mouths. Don't try to say, well, I know exactly how you feel because my story is just like yours. Let me tell you about it. We're so tempted by that. We're so tempted to bring our story into the picture instead of letting the other person's story lead the time of reconciliation. It's really neat if you get a chance to read War in the Soul and as well Warrior's Return. Dr. Tick will lead reconciliation retreats. He's taken hundreds and hundreds of Vietnam veterans back to Vietnam so that they can eventually find reconciliation and healing. So many of them say, I haven't slept full night's sleep in the 30 years since leaving Vietnam, and as soon as I got back to Vietnam, I was able to sleep. He literally takes them to Ho Chi Minh City, which is the old capital of Saigon. He leads them to the battlefields. He leads some of these men who were in country in 1968 when the worst civilian massacre took place. And he takes them back to the battlefield to see that, you know, now what stands in that horrific massacre site is a thriving village once again. And there's also a memorial and a museum dedicated to what took place at that point in time so they can remember. There's a healing property of remembering and going back to the site. So many of these veterans were not allowed to tell their stories. When they got home, they weren't welcomed home. They weren't treated well. And so now they're being reconciled to that. Communities are realizing that, you know what, We need to welcome home these veterans from 50 years ago, from 70 years ago, who didn't get the proper welcome when they first came home. So really, ultimately, there's a fork in the road. We can go left, we can go right. As we look at trauma, as we look at folks who have experienced these innermost pains that have wounded their soul, have this wounding that has caused this moral distress. Am I good enough? Am I acceptable? Can I ever be forgiven? Can I ever feel clean and whole again? We have a path that sees these traumatic experiences just, oh, they're just an abnormal occasion. You know, what happened to you was just an abnormal occasion, even if that occasion happened over and over and over. We can view the people who've experienced trauma as disabled citizens. We can try to teach these disabled citizens how to control their stress. We can try to help them separate from the trauma by never talking about the trauma, never confronting the symptoms. We can just medicate them and tell them that it's all going to be okay. And ultimately, Tick says that this is a recipe for PTSD symptoms. This is a recipe. If we treat people who have experienced trauma and violence and war, and we treat them as somehow abnormal, then we're setting them up to have a disorder. However, the second path, which I would advocate for, and I think we can all be supportive helpers along that path. We can stand along the sides of that path like the people who are along the sides of a parade cheering on the floats as they pass by. We can be those people along the path, along the marathon runners, handing out cups of cold water, cheering people on, getting our cowbells out there to, I don't know why they cheer with cowbells, but it's a good thing. We can be the cheerleaders along the journey if we just see trauma as a lifelong journey towards restoration. These people and you and I, if any of us have experienced trauma at any level, whatever level you've experienced trauma at, you are not abnormal. You are on a lifelong journey to find wholeness and healing and restoration for what has happened. Maybe that wholeness and healing and restoration came really quickly because it was a car accident and you thankfully walked away okay. Wonderful. Maybe you experienced a level of deep woundedness and hurt and a loss of identity and a loss of innocence from that pain, and you need to know that it's okay to be on a lifelong journey to find restoration, to find healing. That this journey can be transformative. It doesn't have to be just control stress, manage the symptoms. It really can be a transformation to find a new identity. It can be, again, a soul restoration. It can be highlighted by breakthrough. Instead of separation from the trauma, we can break through the trauma. We can break through the symptoms that have left us paralyzed and crippled. And instead of seeing it as a disorder, we can see this post-traumatic stress growth. We can grow through the experience. Tick is a huge supporter of the work of people like military chaplains, people like VA workers, the medical profession, the psychiatric profession, the psychological folks, the religious orders that are out there trying to support these folks. And I love this. I'm a huge fan of this image of a transformation journey. And so a transformation journey is really borrowing from the mythological societies of Native Americans, Greek mythology, that saw that there's a rite of passage, that every young man, every young woman would go through certain rites of passage. And for the young men in these ancient cultures, oftentimes it was the warrior rite of passage. They would not be considered a real man until they had gone through their first warrior initiation. So in our modern society, a lot of us don't really think of being initiated as a warrior or initiations that led to womanhood. But in their culture and in their time, this was a very important thing. The rite of passage, basically, think about the time of getting your driver's license. So from ages birth to 16, there were a lot of little mini milestones. There was the milestone of birth, the milestone of sitting up, the milestone of taking your first steps, the milestone of talking, walking further distances, communication milestones, going to school is a huge rite of passage. Each of these milestones along the way ultimately lead to when you're 16 and you can get that driver's license. Once you've kind of gotten that license, it's like you're a whole new young man, a young woman. You've arrived on the scene. Another rite of passage is leaving the nest, going off to school, going off to the military, going off to work. Those are huge opportunities in terms of a rite of passage. In that rite of passage, you go from an oriented stage to something kind of gets disoriented. You're thrown into the deep end of the pool, and you have to learn to swim. And in that experience, it can be very disorienting. So you have to purge those negative emotions. It's very disheartening to feel like you're about to drown. And so once you get to the shoreline, it's important to talk about what it was like to feel like you were about to drown. The Native American culture used the times of dance and drum and art to fuel this rite of passage into a manhood and womanhood. It was an opportunity to forgive and reconcile. It was an opportunity to come back to the campfire after your first battle and tell your story. That was so important. They knew how to tell their story, and that's how they transformed through this rite of passage. They transformed after the battle into a warrior, into someone who is prepared for what would happen next. So Dr. Tick again, we don't heal PTSD, we restore the soul and the spirit. We reconnect to community, history, and cosmos. I think that's so key, and I think that's so helpful and healing for folks of whatever sense of trauma and whatever sense of violence that they've experienced, that they reconnect to history, reconnect to a healthy community, and reconnect just to the greater, larger picture of there's a great big wide world out there that we can connect to. So we honor their scars and their wounds, and we plumb them for wisdom. We travel from shame to honor, wound to gift, and curse to blessing. So you all have listened to me now for quite a while, and I appreciate you hanging there with me. At least I think you're all still with me. I'm going to take a moment here and unmute. And so if you all have a question, if you all have a comment, if you all have something that you'd like to share with the group or want to know more about, I'd be glad to try in the next 5 to 10 minutes address those, and then we'll get you on your way at approximately at 12:30. And I've got another slide here with some resources on it. So are there any questions or comments or anything you all would like to share from our time together today?
Well, Nate, this is Joni. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hi, Joni.
Hi. I guess I never really fully understood PTSD, so this has been very eye-opening as how you do restore the soul, because I didn't really ever think of it as the soul being injured. So this has been fascinating. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, and I don't know about you all, but I always had in my head PTSD is just for the military veteran people, but anyone who's gone through trauma can share these symptoms and can share the need for returning to wholeness. And so it's good for all of us to grow in our awareness of this situation. Other thoughts, comments, and if you would like to put them in the chat box, feel free to. Yeah, again, I just want to reiterate and thank you all for being here. You all are out there caring for people who may have gone through traumatic events and maybe they haven't. Not everybody has this struggle. Their struggle might look like something completely different, but hopefully we can all bring just one more ounce of compassion, one more ounce of skillful listening to this companionship journey with folks, whether it's through the PTSD journey, whether it's through the troubled trauma of childhood, whether it's through family distress, whether it's through other anxieties and difficulties that someone deals with. So I want to highlight a couple things here. So you can hopefully see on the screen here some resources. I mentioned these two books, War in the Soul and Warrior's Return by Dr. Tick. And if you have an interest in going further with this subject and this topic, I'd encourage you to also check out The Hero Within by Deborah Grassman. Deborah is a nurse practitioner who's worked in the VA for close to 30 or 40 years, and she's really founded an amazing grassroots effort to bring hope and healing and restoration to our wounded veterans. And her organization is called Opus Peace, opuspeace.org. And also, if you're involved in the hospice world through the Hospice Foundation of America, you can go to hospicefoundation.org, and you can actually take a self-guided course on Opus Peace and some of the things that Deborah Grassman has been doing. You can also find Dr. Tick at soldiersheart.net. That's soldiersheart.net, and see some of the work that he is doing. Again, I just want to thank you all so much, whether you're listening in person or you're catching this recording later. Again, my hope is to bring you some encouraging resources here to pour into your life so that you can bring more encouragement, more compassion, more skillful listening to the folks who have fractured souls, people who have experienced violence as a child or violence as an adult, people who have gone to war and came back a completely different person, someone who just, the pains and the aches and the traumas of life have just compiled upon them, and maybe you're the one person that can listen and encourage that person and bring a skillful, compassionate presence to their life. So may you be blessed in your journeys ahead. May you bring lots of compassion and love to these people out there who are struggling. And I look forward to seeing you next time on our next Soul Series webinar. Thank you again for joining me today. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you, Nate. Have a good one.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you all for joining us. Have a great day.
You too.